All set? Well, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate the participation. We've got a good full audience here. We've got a great panel today. Against the wider backdrop of the discussions around building sustainable, resilient infrastructure into the face of climate change, we're here specifically to talk about resilience of ports, terminals, and trade-related infrastructure and operations. I'm Frank Sweet, and I will moderate the session. Let me just introduce you to our panelists. In the pink, we have got Suzanne Johnson, Senior Advisor, Ocean Stewardship Coalition, United Nations. Down at the far end, we've got Bertrand Milot, Head of Sustainability at CDPQ. In the middle, we've got Timon Meester, Group Chief Operating Officer, Ports and Terminals, DP World. And then to my left, we've got Matthew. Got to turn the mic on.
It's working now, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I couldn't handle that one. All right. We are going to jump right into this panel discussion. I'm going to start, Matthew, with you, though, perhaps, just to generally set the stage. So Matthew's office at the UN, has developed a report that outlines high-level principles and priorities for developing resilient infrastructure. Matthew, can you explain sort of the highlights of that?
Sure. Thank you, Frank, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Matthew Voogstaat. I work for the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. And one of the topics we're focusing on is resilient infrastructure, and of course the topic of today. And the reason is very simple. I mean, if we talk about the risk that infrastructure are facing today, we're working very closely with the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, and recently we published an estimate of the cost of disaster to infrastructure assets, and annually the cost is estimated to $700 billion. So that's a huge amount of money that we're losing every year because of disasters. It's actually more than the GDP of my home country, Belgium. So every year we're losing because of disasters to infrastructure damages the size of the Belgium economy. So from the UN perspective, that's something that we need to address. We cannot continue on the same trajectory, and especially because, of course, with the climate change and others, we see an increasing frequency and intensity of disasters over time. We have estimated that by 2050 there will be an increase by 40% of the number of disasters. So you get the picture. If we continue on that trajectory, this is not sustainable. So we have to do something about it, and what we are focusing at the UN Disaster Risk Reduction Office is trying to prevent those disasters from happening, and also, whenever they happen, to try to minimize the cost of damages to not only to the infrastructure asset, but also, of course, to people and the livelihood of people. So in that context, what we came up with is to see how do we do that. And I mean, I think we all agree on the goal, but how to turn that goal into action is not that straightforward. So we have worked with all the government trying to carve out what are the principles for resilient infrastructure. What does that mean for an infrastructure asset to be resilient? And we have defined 6 principles. And the question, what we're doing now with the countries we're supporting, and we're working in countries like Tonga, Madagascar, Chile, Bhutan, very different geographies, but those principles are applicable anywhere. And we're doing with that, we're trying to see whether the current practices are meeting those principles, whether there are some gaps, whether there are some areas that can improve. And we try to develop with them an action plan to turn those principles into action for improving the resiliency of the infrastructure assets. And it's to start with, of course, the important is to look at what are the vulnerabilities. And so we're doing also a lot of work in terms of risk analysis, risk knowledge, and trying to use satellite imageries and so on to assess where the vulnerabilities of infrastructure system are, what are the type of hazards they could be facing, and really taking this multi-hazard landscape. So we talk a lot about climate change, but there are other hazards, of course, that are very important to consider when we talk about resilient infrastructure. And so maybe, maybe I don't want to talk for too long, but that's really what we're trying to do, and trying also to see how we can mobilize the financing that will then allow the governments to turn those recommendations and action into realities. And I think that's something that we're working very closely with our government on.
Good. Very
Maybe
good.
I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Suzanne, perhaps you could build on that a little bit, discussing your work and approach to multilateral collaboration.
Thanks, Frank. Yeah, hello, everybody. I'm Suzanne Johnson with the UN Global Compact, and we sometimes call that the private sector organization within the UN. We work very closely with industry, and in particular, I'm on the Ocean Initiative. So we focus on the sustainable ocean economy and working with companies, offshore renewables, shipping, ports, aquaculture, fisheries, all industries that are in the ocean economy. How can they become more sustainable? And we partner with companies to do that on their journey. But increasingly, for reasons that you said, Matthew, that resilience is part of sustainability. The supply chains within the ocean economy are, vital. And there's this saying, you're only as resilient as the least resilient part of your supply chain. Right. And we view ports very much as the critical infrastructure that links the economy, the communities, the land, and the sea. So we've been putting a particular emphasis on partnering with ports to help that transition into sustainability and resilience. And in another UN way, we take a complementary set of frameworks to your work, Matthew. And we've just put out a set of sustainable ports guidances. So if any of you are in, the ports value chain, I would encourage you to look at those. They're a set of 9 principles that look after, the ability for ports to help in ocean health, in the governance of the ocean, in ocean data. But they really look also at some cross-cutting themes, one of which is resilience. And it's a good reference, I would say, if you are in that space. This can be used by companies, but it can also be used by financial players to do due diligence on the sustainability trajectory of a ports-related company. But very much, one of the things as we thought about what type of ports does this guidance apply to, recognizing that ports are very, very unique characters, each one in the resilience equation. And there's that saying that, if you've seen one thing, you've seen it all. And they say in ports, if you've seen one port, you've seen one port. They're each very different from each other, and they each have very unique characteristics. So we consider, looking at an overarching systemic approach to helping to support ports resilience as a node between the land and sea interface and communities. We're going to need an incredible amount of funding for this transition, and I think we can talk about that in the next, in the next round of questions. But I wanted to bring up that new tool that's out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Bertrand?
To what has been said, just specifically on ports, CDPQ is a global player. We're a pension plan. We have about $60 billion invested in infrastructure, another 50 in real estate. And so we take these issues very, very seriously. And I think an important part, and it was said, your value chain is as strong as its weakest link. When we look at ports, or we look at anything, it's really important to go beyond the asset itself. We have one in the portfolio where we know there's questions related to sea level rise, but actually we also know that the rail and the road that link to this port are going to be underwater and part of the city that the port serves. We don't own the road and the rail or the city. And so one really has to look at things broadly as an investor to make sure that you anticipate what is happening around the asset. You understand it conceptually, but in finance it's a completely new topic. Usually when we invest in something, we just look at that thing that we have in the portfolio. Here you need to look much more broadly.
Thank you very much, Bertrand. Rocky, I owe you an apology. I skipped over you during my introduction, so I'd like to make sure everyone knows that we got Rocky Kumar here. She's the Senior Vice President of Sustainability Solutions and Business Integration at Liberty Mutual. And of course, she brings an insurer's perspective to this. Do you want to give us your perspective?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. And so Liberty Mutual is a large property and casualty insurer, global insurer, and we do insure a lot of the shipping activities as well as infrastructure building and construction and cargo movements, etc. So in some ways, insurance helps facilitate both economic activity and financing activities. And when it comes to infrastructure resiliency, especially in the shipping area, we ask these broader system level questions. Here's what we know about the shipping industry. 80% of goods that are transported today are transported by sea. It's very vitally important for many of the developing markets. 61% of their imports, 55% of their exports are coming from sea. Another interesting fact is, why is sea so important? Because 44% of global population live within 150 miles off the coast. That means it's not just about getting it to the port, but also, as Bertrand said, it's moving it into the markets where people live, and that expands the geographic zone that you need to think about. What we do know, at least in the first round, is that sea level rise is happening, and that's just one of the many physical risks that we need to consider. And that's, so the resiliency aspect is there. These assets we are talking about are not short-term assets. These assets can last from 30 to 50 years, and in some cases, they stretch it out to 70 years. So these are not any kind of investment going in today. The next time you're going to reinvest is going to be in 2050, 2070. So that's something to keep in mind. I'll just talk about physical risks. Everyone talks about physical risks. I think you mentioned there's going to be more severe different storms, etc. But you need to also think about the idea of what happens to demand, right? Or what happens to your supply chain risk. That's another insurable risk that we need to think about, because if you have changing trade routes, you have delays in your supplies coming through because of weather-related events. All of these are real risks that we need to consider when it comes to shipping, etc.
Thank you very much, Rocky. Timon, I'd certainly like to get your operational perspective as a port operator. Specifically, how your business, how people in the ports business and in maritime transport can evolve their organizations and their operational footprint to make your infrastructure more resilient.
This thing, yeah, it works. You hear me? It's very difficult to hear ourselves, actually. So, most of you hopefully know DP World, because when you talk DP World, in essence, you talk transportation, and from my position specifically, are container terminals around the world. And if you talk about resilience, for us, kind of the first line of defense is changing weather. And changing weather is happening in She's louder than me. And changing weather.
May I have your attention, please? The exhibition closes in 1 hour.
All right, here we go. So changing weather is a phenomenon we're dealing with as we speak, and I want to give you a few examples that kind of bring it to light. First, if you go to the Pacific Ocean, and everybody's heard about El Nino, then we can see, and we actually own 7 facilities on the West Coast, both North America and South America, where the wave action today is higher than it was 10 years ago. So the general size of the swell is higher. And that means, for instance, in San Antonio in Chile, we actually close 30 days out of the years. It's not operational because the waves are too high. The good news is people are innovative and they like to seek solutions. And, you know, ships go alongside, we moor them with ropes. And in San Antonio, we're evolving to a dynamic system where the ships are moored through vacuum clamps that can move with the waves. And so there is a way to adapt to these kind of things. However, there are also elements that are more severe. So we have a large facility in the Caribbean. And as you know, and sometimes see in the news, there's tropical storms typically coming out of the doldrums and going through the Caribbean into the US. And so a few times a year, we actually get the warnings, we track the path, and physically close the terminal for 2 to 3 to 4 days, depending on the strength of the winds, etc. But that's an operational capability, because remember, these big ships are handled by big cranes. They're very susceptible to high winds, so we have to tie them down and stop everything. But it's also a capability that we've developed, and specifically this terminal, which has it 2 to 3 times a year, they actually know really how to do this. Other phenomena that we see, as of recent, is drought. The biggest examples are the Panama Canal. You must have seen that in the news, where the water levels are at an all-time low. But the River Rhine and the River Maas in Europe have had seen similar things. In the end of the day, you can't do much about it. Cargo will find its way, but there will be constraints in the supply chain to get to destination. The shipping lines are actually rerouting things differently because of the Panama Canal problem that we have. Another very interesting development we've seen is in South Korea. In South Korea, we've seen more prevalent high winds in the last couple of years than we've ever had. And they come sudden. And you know, if you look at these container terminals, you see containers spread out everywhere, sometimes pretty high. And if the winds are high, the containers can fall off. And the team has developed a software that downloads weather information. Then the software communicates with the terminal operating system, looks at the landscape of the terminals, and takes down the little mountains and equalizes the yard ahead of the high winds. And again, so through technology, you can actually build in some good resilience. But my point of today was, you know, for us, it starts with weather. We haven't talked about decarbonization or sustainability, but weather is really the first line of defense for the port operations.
That was fascinating. Rocky, do you have a comment?
I was going to talk about transition risk and the transition risk to the sector, which goes into the decarbonization aspect.
Go right ahead.
Well, so one of the things we do at Liberty is because, you know, as you said, we start with physical risk because obviously we're underwriting physical risk, but we also try to understand how the sector is going to get challenged. And when you look at the models and the scenario models, shipping typically is considered a hard to decarbonized sector, and really most of the models bring shipping into play in the 2045 to 2070 time horizon. The reality is today, because of the carbon border tax that Europe has put in, which means in 2 years from now, all emissions from shipping will be added and paid for when you talk about costs or different kinds of goods being landed in Europe. That suddenly has brought shipping into focus today, not 2040, which was what the models are predicting. And that decarbonization for the shipping industry is something I would love to hear from you. What about technology? I know there are a lot of startup technologies, but is it possible for the shipping industry to start decarbonizing? And what are you seeing in that is something I find interesting, because the carbon border tax is not something people think about when they think about really having to push decarbonization in the shipping industry.
You're putting me on the spot, but that's okay. So the shipping industry, and specifically shipping, the supply chain is many things, but specifically shipping, suffers from an enormous dilemma. And that is the fact that, you know, in the end of the day, the ships run on black bunker oil. And that is basically a consequence of history, and we all know this. And so to change this, many, many things need to happen. And the first thing as a port operator is, you know, what can you do to contribute to it? We're not a shipping line in the direct sense, but as a port operator, you can actually entice change. And the first thing that you need to do is to make sure that alternative fuels are becoming available at scale. This is the most important thing to remember. It's up to the shipping lines to say, I'm going to bet on LNG, ammonia, methanol, bio, etc., etc. But today there is no solution at scale globally. And so therefore you see a lot of these announcements of shipping lines ordering dual fuel ships, meaning they can switch back to the black and hopefully use the good stuff when they can. But it's up to the ports to make it available. So I think that's my first answer to this question. The second thing, and this is underestimated, is that ports also have a role in what we call hooking them up to the grid when they come at the berth. And that means they can switch their engine off, plug in their electricity, and keep their auxiliary engines running. This is not a given, because this is a big infrastructure expense in most ports. It's emerging, but it's non-standardized, and some countries take a different approach than others. But that's also a huge role ports can play. And the third role the ports can play is actually to make sure that the grid that comes into the port, the electricity from it comes from renewable sources, to make sure that you actually double green and not around. On the carbon tax, this is a very difficult global subject. I think it's inevitable that it's coming. What you will see typically is Europe will take the lead. But the risk is that the European consumer is going to pay the first price vis-a-vis the other consumers. And it should not be a model where countries are starting to compete with each other for, you know, the cheapest supply chain versus the other. So you need an equitable system where the tax is uniform and that the money collected is not an ATM machine, to be blunt, but actually used to entice reinvestment.
Matthew?
You know, I was listening to it, and very fascinating to hear this very practical example that you're mentioning. And that brings me to think about a little bit the big picture in terms of investment. I mean, you mentioned all the adaptation that you have to face, and I was struck by the discussion over the last few days at COP, how much resilience and adaptation were at the forefront. And when we see the level of investment that are needed and the importance of bringing the resiliency aspect into the discussion, and that's something we're trying to do with the investors that we are gathering, trying to make sure that all these principles I was mentioning about what it means to be resilient are embedded in the investment decision processes of the big investors. And I know CDPQ is probably one of at the forefront of those thinking. But I was also talking to other investors, and they realized that the climate scenario they used to work with are no longer valid, and some of the assumptions that were made in the past are not correct anymore. And that means they need to rethink a little bit their approach to investment. And I think it's really critical, because we have trillions of investments that are required, and we must make sure that those investments are resilient. And similarly, we have a stock of assets that need to be retrofit. And again, we need to have those resilience embedded from the beginning. And I think that's something that I would like to see emerging even more. And I know it's a hard topic in the finance industry, but if we can find a way to really make sure it's all the investment decisions are risk informed and embedding the principle of resilient infrastructure, I think there will be a very positive impact, especially in the long run.
Thank you, Matthew. Suzanne, anything to add?
Thanks. I was going to actually talk about Timon's point of, this vast investment that needs to be made in, new fuels for the shipping value chain. And, of the trillions of dollars needed, most of that money is going to be needed for landside infrastructure for new fuels. The Green Pioneer is an ammonia-based ship that's parked in the marina right now in Dubai. Many of you have probably been on it in the past couple of days, but it's a great example of the starting out of new fuels. But I did want to talk a little bit about, then flipping over to the point about working with investors. And, what we hear from working with investors as well as they'd like to be very welcoming to, for example, bond issuers, companies borrowing money, but they would very much encourage early engagement in the process so that things like resiliency and matters, features that they care about are factored in. I've seen this in a recent blue bond guidance that was written by the International Capital Markets Association, which kind of clarifies what the use of proceeds can be for a blue bond. It encompasses 8 areas within the ocean economy, including shipping and ports, and very much encourages resilience. We've seen already blue bonds issued for offshore renewables, for waste, for various sovereigns. Hopefully we might see something around shipping or ports in the near future. But I'd love to hear more from the investor's point of view on investment in this space.
Thank you. I mean, to us, as I was saying, we take quite a serious approach to this issue, and a lot of the resilience has to come from the private sector. They operate most of the world economy, and therefore they need to be aware of these issues. So our strategy here is we use tools to identify risks going forward, and one has to use the old crystal balls. Nobody has climate models are climate models. What we do then is we alert the CEOs or the senior management of portfolio companies to say, well, we've identified that you have a problem, were you aware, and what are you going to do about it? And this is very important. It's also very important because the building codes that we're working on under today, even today, if you build something new today, the building code is likely to be the same one that was enforced 20 years ago. And most building codes actually consider weather events of the past and take out the extreme, because you don't want to overbuild, which is exactly what one should not be doing in a climate change thing. So it's very important that people be alert and use quite a range of scenario and actually plan their resilience around this and make investments. Could be simple investments to strengthen your roof or make sure your drains are bigger because it rains more or there's more sudden storms. It could be much more costly and complex. As I was alluded to also, there is quite an important need for dialogue. In the example I gave earlier with the port, well, we don't own the rail and the road links, and obviously the fact that the city may be flooded is an issue, a big issue. And so private sector needs to interact with the public sector, with the city government, with the road authority, whatever that is, in federal countries, with the state government and the federal government. There needs to be a dialogue because no one party is going to resolve as the means to fix the problem. The problem involves multi-party, multi-stakeholder, and there must be a solution. With regards to your question on resilience bonds, I think there is, we buy green bonds, so why not buy blue bonds and resilient bonds, etc. I think the question, or we may be able to finance PPPs, public-private partnership. For those who are not well versed into what that is, in the healthcare sector, for example, governments may run the healthcare sector, but they need a new hospital. And therefore, we would finance and build the hospital, assure that the water is running, the air conditioning is running, etc. But the healthcare services are provided by the local government, and they just pay rent on the building. The same thing could be used to finance dikes, to finance resilient infrastructure at the national level. The issue there is that a lot of governments are not quite yet aware of that they have a problem and haven't figured out the solution to it. So the first thing is make sure they are aware and potentially help them define solutions and decide, okay, well, do I want to issue a resilience bond which would be on the government's balance sheet, or do I want to involve the private sector to build and operate whatever is needed, and that's called a public-private partnership.
Thank you. Rocky, I think you all set?
I just wanted to say, we talk about the private sector having to put money into resiliency, but recently I heard that of all the private sector money going into any kind of green financing, 97% of that money goes to mitigation efforts. Only 3% of that goes to resiliency. So if you're waiting for the private sector to get into this, it is going to take a long time, or we need to shift the way we're thinking about the role companies have to play and give resiliency its equal attention in the transition to a low carbon economy.
Thank you. Matthew?
Yeah, maybe if I can respond to that, and I think that's a very good point. And the question about the resilience bond that you were mentioning, I think the question is, can we create a momentum in the capital market for directing more investment to resiliency? And of course, resilience bonds are not going to be revolutionary. There are green bonds and a use of proceeds type of bonds. But what they could bring is a greater attention to this issue from the issuer, so the government or the private company issuing those bonds, and try to spur internally a discussion about how they can invest into their resiliency. And I think that's one of the advantage that we see, and that's why we have worked with the Climate Bond Initiative on a taxonomy, on a resilience taxonomy that can support development of those financial products to drive more capital towards this question, but also create more awareness and also a possibility for companies or government to signal to the market that they are serious about those issues, that they are going to invest in those issues. So it's actually hitting a different purposes. It's not only about financing, it's also about changing the way companies and government are thinking, and also giving them an opportunity to signal to the market the importance of resiliency for their government or for the company itself.
Thank you, Matthew. So, bear with me just a minute. Timon, I'm wondering if you can elaborate on some of your answers and maybe give us some other specific examples of ways the DP World has been building resiliency into some of your projects, some of your ports projects.
Repeat the last question.
If you could think about and provide an example or two of ways that your organization has been able to build resilience into specific ports projects.
I have to kind of split it in two again, because the first line of defense for us is the height of the water, how much water comes down, droughts and these kind of things. We actually recently did a full analysis of our portfolio around the world and did a weather check, so to speak. But surprisingly, we came out quite well. It is resilient to change, and there's a way to manage this thing. And so So we're very happy with the operational preparedness for any eventualities on one hand. I think our challenge right now is really the change in Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions and drive this hard, as well as changing the fleet of the shipping company that we do run in the house. I start with Scope 2, and I call that low-hanging fruit. So in a number of locations, it's been, I wouldn't say easy, but through a push, it has been able to quickly convert the energy that we take from the grid to certified renewables. And today we're over 50% in just a few years. So, I'm very confident, at least on the port side, we can be in the 70-80% range, let's say by 2030, on that element. However, there's a new bottleneck emerging, and that's the lack of renewable-based electricity in certain countries. So you're going to get very specific. So in Europe, this is not going to be a problem. In Canada, this is not going to be a problem. But if you go to South Korea, Australia, a little bit of UK, if you go to Brazil, there's countries where you can't entirely see yet the trajectory going aggressively. Then there's a few African countries where there is no program at all. And so it's a little bit back against the wall than what you do, because electrification for us is a major bet to make sure we can do this all sustainably. And so we're partnering up with companies who say, look, we are willing to go with you into Senegal or into Somaliland or where we need to be, build you the park, whether it's offshore, solar, and then we purchase a 20-year offtake agreement or something like that. So in those elements, you'll have to force change with partners, and then hopefully those partners are strong enough with capital and with regulators to make it happen. My last point is, we talked about investments. I can see for us, most of the money that we're going to need is around electrification, to change from diesel to electric. Because for us it means changing infrastructure, the cables in the ground, they need to be weather resistant, water resistant, etc. And then of course the conversion for plugged in machinery or EV machinery. But we also now see there's another bottleneck emerging. Everybody is doing this, and the whole supply of machines is behind demand. So this is not a matter of will anymore, this is a matter of what we call the equipment supply chain not having enough momentum to cater for everybody. And so one of the initiatives we took to counter that is because there's lack of standardization, there's lack of, let's say, insight in the total cost of ownership to switch from diesel to electric. So we signed up with a competitor to actually say, let's look at this holistically for the entire industry, create some standardization, everybody to go on board, and see if we can drive change quicker together. So anyway, these are some of the snapshot issues we're dealing with as we go. But I think in the end of the day, I'm very optimistic that this will go fast, one way or the other. But we're back to the marine fuel as the last remaining dinosaur that we need to tackle collectively, because that will not be done by a company. It will not be. That's a joint collaborative effort.
I agree. Any other comments from the panelists on Timon's remarks? Okay, Timon, I got one follow-on question. I don't know if you touched on hydrogen or not, but we've been doing some projects in ports where we've been helping hydrogen producers connect with users at the port facilities.
Yeah. So first of all, kind of the bad news for those who are into hydrogen, I think in our industry, on the ports, the solution is 80% electrification. But it's 80, it's not 100. I think hydrogen will have a good role to play in those areas where there's green hydrogen available and easily and competitively. A hydrogen fuel cell in our world is a fairly expensive solution still as a total cost of ownership. And so, let's say here in Dubai, west coast of Canada, where the green hydrogen may become available at reasonable scale, we are doing some R&D and some testing to see whether we can convert some diesel engines to hydrogen fuel cell engines. And so my point of all of this is I think you'll see some application in the terminal business, but sporadically, but not globally. That's electrification.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The other, to fill the 20% gap, you will also see some experimentation on biofuels. For instance, in Europe, where you can actually change the diesel fuel to a biofuel if nothing else is available. And so, all those little elements will add up to the 20%, but electrification for us is the way to go.
Yeah, that's very insightful. And I think perhaps the reason that my firm is directly involved with the hydrogen project in the Port of LA is because of the mandates that the state has put on the truckers. They have to be carbon free, and they're buying electric trucks and hydrogen trucks right now. So a very new pointy end of the market right there. Any other perspectives anyone wants to offer?
I think one of the things we've touched upon, but we haven't really gone deeper into, is trade and disruption of trade routes, right? So we did talk a bit about how trade and how weather-related patterns are impacting how your, maybe delays in supply chain, etc. But when you think about finance, we also think about trade finance and insurance on trade. And I think the question of what happens as we as a society try to decarbonize, and in terms of where people, one of the big aspects are humans and the ability to live where we currently live, where some of these assets are, and then what are the new areas we're going to require, places which may not, where populations are growing, where the demand is growing, and that's all in the Asia and Africa regions. And so I think one of the other aspects is the trade, and I'm just connecting the dots to what you're saying around, where you're going to get renewable fuels. These countries in Asia, Africa, that's where you need to decarbonize. So you think about trade, the shifting of trade, the impact of, whether you're going to have Europe starting to produce at home because of costs, etc. But then most of the demand coming and exchange of goods happening between emerging markets. And so I do think that when we think about trade finance also, we need to think about these risks in trade finance, and that also needs to be brought in, that these risks, on climate risks, that need to be considered, and the shifting of that, which will have an impact on where most of your demand comes from, in terms of the new kinds of ports to be built and the infrastructure that is built. I think that's just an element which is outside of normal conversation that we want to bring in about, as a transition risk, shifting trade patterns too.
Maybe just a comment from my side that I understand what you're saying and I recognize it. I think what is happening is, let's say if we go into Africa and we make an investment, the contribution of the investment is that you uplift the infrastructure to the most modern levels that you can sustain and do. But funny enough, the trend today is still so that the ports... Oh, there she is. She's back.
Only to you.
The trend is still that the ports are leaving the city, first and foremost.
May I have your attention, please? The exhibition closes in 30 minutes.
I think we're being told to get out of here. It sounds like it. But anyway, in all seriousness, so we see in a number of areas we're pushed to design latest, design infrastructure, but away from the cities, which is great because that's the congestion urban areas, and we have to move to the industrial areas. And so this helps a lot. I want to make another comment here, maybe not entirely related, but quite important. So infrastructure generally by governments is managed through regulators who put it on the market for tender out to a concession, meaning they're looking for operators to build it, run it, and transfer it in a 20, 30, 40-year time frame. And so we're in the business of responding to these tenders, usually. If you look at what the regulators put forward, they love two things in our business: volume and money, because that drives the machine. And you know, we are trying to make a case you should incorporate sustainability and decarbonization performance as part of the criteria to make your final solution. It's great to have the most income from your infrastructure, but you also want to have that, you know, decarbonization is one example, performance. And it's important government starts to listen. I think it's coming more and more clear, but like in Africa, there's still a long way to go on this one.
Thank you. Matthew, do you have something to add?
Well, not directly to that, but just reflecting on the overall topic and what you mentioned about the resiliency of the electricity grid that is actually connecting and allowing you to decarbonize. And I think that's what the approach we're looking is that, I mean, of course, all these infrastructure networks are very much connected. I mean, you need the electricity grid to function. The economy needs the port to function. If the telecommunication fails, then you have a problem with your operation because you're failing. You cannot communicate with your operation center. So there are this kind of system approach and the independency that is important for government to understand for their planning to make those linkages evident. And that's what, again, we're trying when we work with the government that we're working with. Like I mentioned a few. Really looking at this system and how all the different networks are connected and how the failure of one system will have a cascading impact, which is something that everyone is looking at its own asset and creating the connection between the different sectors. I think we see a lot of value in that and bringing those like the port operators with the energy, with the telecommunication. I think there's a lot of value in allowing those kind of interconnection, intersectorial approach.
Thank you. Any other perspectives? Bertrand? No? Okay, I'm going to just say a few things here to prepare for closing. I'm going to ask each of the speakers to just provide any final closing thoughts they've got, what they got out of this conversation, perhaps what they've got out of the whole conference, just final thoughts you'd like to leave with our audience. I was in a session earlier today for young engineers, and we had Dr. Bertrand Piccard speaking as a keynote speaker, and he spoke about energy transition, and he used it in the context of his solar plane that he'd used. And I asked him at the end of that presentation, you know, there was discussion going on yesterday in the Blue Zone about the communication coming out of the talks here, specific to limiting fossil fuel use and phasing it out. And they had 3 different options about how to present that. And I asked him what he thought about that versus a policy communication on supply side on renewable energy, because renewable energy costs less than fossil fuel at this point. And he firmly came out on the side that trying to force people to give up fossil fuel is the wrong approach. The better approach is to provide people with the better alternative. And I think that's going to drive energy transition in general at a very fast rate. I think this has been a fascinating conversation because we're talking about a complex industry that's hard to decarbonize, but a very critical industry with very critical infrastructure that we all depend on every single day. So I think this has been a wonderful conversation. Bertrand, any final comments?
I fully agree with you that we need to collectively work on reducing demand of fossil fuel through all the systems that are available to resolve this issue. I would say collaboration. All these issues are linked. There is networks, there is converging or diverging parties. Finance alone is not going to solve the problem. We don't operate ports, we don't build ports, we finance them. They are built by contractors, operated by the likes of DP World. There is civil society issues, there is links with government. We all need to talk to each other to resolve these issues at the system level and choose the best solution. And that's just not in ports, but in anything else related to the energy transition.
Thank you. Suzanne?
Well, thank you for that. And I would pick up on your point when you talk about collaboration. They say that collaboration is the leadership of the 21st century. But you're an investor. The point that I am picking up from this conversation is that each stakeholder really does have influence over what can happen and moving things forward. So Bertrand, you talked about working with the boards of the companies that you invest in to try to get them to act in a more intentional way. And manage those risks. And Tiemens, you talked about, impacting and influencing, your clients or the shipping companies, or in the stakeholders that work with your port systems and ports management. And then, it was also talked about by Matthew and Rika about how regulators have influence and being able to incorporate more sustainability criteria into their tendering processes or their concessional processes, et cetera. So there's a lot of way in for action, and I think that we've all talked about that on the panel today. That was my takeaway from our conversation.
Great, thank you, Suzanne. Timon, I'm going to save you for last. Matthew?
I mean, just maybe one last word. We talk a bit about finance, and what we see from the studies that we looked at is that investing in resilience actually pay back. There are different numbers around, but one of the studies from the World Bank was showing like every dollar invested in resilience infrastructure leads to $4 benefit down the line. So the question is, how do we make sure those investments are made? And there are many reasons why they're not happening, because of budget constraint, because of long-term horizon, because some of the avoiding losses are difficult to capture in terms of revenue. So there are many reasons, but we must find a way to really go around those reasons of what is not happening, because it actually makes a lot of sense. It can save lives, it can save infrastructure assets, it can save the economy of many countries. So it's trying, and I think by bringing the stakeholder, you mentioned, all together, there are ways to actually mobilize this financing, and would be requiring some regulatory input, innovative solution from the finance sector, but also from the operators themselves. And so that's why when we developed the principle for resilient infrastructure that were mentioned at the beginning, that's something we developed actually with all the different stakeholders that are active in the infrastructure sector, the financiers, the operators, the engineers, and what we have done with the principle, we have translated that into a handbook, so how to implement those principles, and looking at what is the role of each of the stakeholders to achieve that kind of resiliency that we want to achieve. And so maybe just an invitation, if you are interested in the topic, to look at that handbook. And I see one of our colleagues from the consultancy business we work with on this, and it's a very kind of a collaborative approach, and I think that's something that we can learn from, and I hope that you find it useful if you read it. But
thank you, Matthew.
That will be my closing. Thank you.
Thank you. Rocky?
Yeah, I've really enjoyed this conversation because it's different. It's different from, talking constantly about just the energy transition.
Yeah.
And I think what my takeaway has been that as Liberty, we pride ourselves in being experts in risk identification, risk quantification, risk mitigation, and risk transfer. As the conversation we've had today has highlighted the number of changes that are going to take, both from a technology as well as from an infrastructure and financing perspective. And so I think if there's one call to action, I would say is all of you should be considering insurance upfront, because we can help partner and increase efficiencies. We'd love to work with you because we are exposed, and we are also here as partners to help de-risk and reduce the cost of the transition if possible.
Thank you, Rocky. Timon?
Well, we are at COP, so maybe my parting comments are around the decarbonization question of the assets. I've been doing this for 30 years, sound like an old man, but I cannot underestimate what has happened the last 5 years and how extraordinary it is, how quickly, we're rallying behind decarbonization in this industry. For decades, efficiency ruled, because efficiency equates value. And for the last 5 years, this has turned extremely fast. But the trick is, I think the drive comes from our moral compass. We want to do this all for the greater good. and partially regulation. The regulation is, I think, the last link to kick this really further is when our customers are starting to demand green solutions, for the lack of better title. Because I still believe if you're put under pressure by your customer, things will happen quicker because you need to have it as a competitive advantage. And for the first time this year, we're getting customers who are asking, can we experiment this one? Or can we do this one? Hopefully in a year from now, there's an RFQ that if you don't, you disqualify, just to put it bluntly. But in all, I'm an optimist. There's a few missing links. I think the marine fuel is a huge question. We'll be in for a decade of a hybrid life in that. But on the asset side, on the land side, I'm quite optimistic on the pace of development.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank the audience. If you would join me in thanking our panelists, I'd appreciate it. Have a good afternoon.